and welcome to this video in which we're going over report writing of penetration testing reports. It's a different type of report, something that I actually have no personal experience on either side. However, I've picked up kind of clues of things that people have done, as well as being able to see publicly disclosed ones. And once you mark one type of report and you understand how you technical write in one kind of aspect, you can very clearly start applying that to different aspects. And the one thing that pen testers, especially graduates, tell me quite quickly in their career is that writing a good report is a skill they wish, one, they had, but they still develop over time when they're in the field, as they say, writing reports. So, starting with the report, it's quite weird that we're talking about pen testing and we're really just talking about the report, and that's because while you are getting paid to hack into systems, it doesn't really matter to the client. The client is asking and paying for the vulnerability or the report, which details all those vulnerabilities in it. They're not caring about how well you hacked into the system or all the cool stuff you did. If it's not written on paper and it's not in the report at the end, then there is really no point. And that could be quite jarring to some people learning pen testing. But you'll come to that. It's one of those things where you come out thinking, right, I'm going to be the best hacker ever, and then you go, oh well, I need to write this in a report. So, that's the kind of thing where you have this report, so they're really paying for the report. They could pay hundreds of thousands of pounds sometimes for just the report. So therefore, it's a little bit of kind of, you've got to do it. So consistent formatting and correct English is pretty much essential. But the main thing that I've kind of highlighted there was that it needs to be actionable, and we'll get to actionable and what that really means. But that's the kind of maybe the cherry on top. Maybe it might be the actual the cream inside a chocolate eclair. It might be the main part of it, but or it could be the kind of bit at the top just to kind of round it off. It depends on the kind of situation. Moving on to the actual report and how it differs from other ones. This is a typical pen test report kind of stuff. It follows a very short and less academic focused structure. And if you were to do, let's say, a bit of coursework in university, then this is not the structure you'd follow. You're starting off with an executive summary, and that's because the report, for the most part, or that part of the report, is aimed at executives. The makeup of that will differ across different organisations. They might ask for certain things. They might have a different style guide. Again, executive summary is almost like an abstract, but it's for a high level kind of target, and it's not meant to summarise everything. It's more meant to summarise the action points of what's needed. And then it continues with front matter. This is where you'll find all the kind of boring legal NDA stuff, as well as the scope and stuff like that. You'll then have a summary. This obviously will be more lengthy than the executive summary. I mean, the executive summary might take up 1 page, 2 pages max, but the summary might be quite a considerable length. And then it'll go through and list each technical finding individually, and then maybe put some of that content in the appendix, and so therefore the person who has to read through the report enter the findings into a ticket system, or, for example, insert or start going through it and trying to rectify these issues. Then they'll go bit by bit through the technical findings and maybe reference the appendix for tool output or something like that. Moving on to each of these sections individually, the executive summary is written for board members and non-technical personnel inside an organisation, the people who are the decision makers, put it that way. So you're really aiming it towards them, not the person you maybe have talked to the full time you're doing a pen test. It's probably their boss or their boss's boss. So we're looking at technical details being very scant, as well as trying to avoid any of that jargon. A boss is not really going to know what a SQL injection is, so we want to keep that away from there and more talk about breaches of confidentiality or potential takeover of the site or defacement, something that they would understand. And you've got to hit the main points. You've got to make sure it has impact on the business. So even when we were talking about, we could take the site offline, what does this really mean? How long would it take to go back online? And could this be done at a moment's notice, or is this kind of long thing? And how much would that then come into their decision of like, okay, we have to fund this vulnerability or to fix this vulnerability? And then we've also got like strategic recommendations. So you could be kind of long term, short term. You really want to try and narrow down to these decision makers. If you spend money on this, it will stop this. If you spend money on this, then we can sort out a lot of problems. That's what they want for the most part, and we need to kind of get going in that direction with your executive summary. When it comes to the technical findings, though, there is a nice little information, or what's called an ISO standard, so International Standard 29147, 2018, means it was published in 2018, but in the Annex B, the appendix of this international standard, there is kind of elements that says you should ask for in a vulnerability report if you're someone who's accepting vulnerabilities, for example, a bug bounty system. And this actually has quite good kind of ideas in which you should be putting in their technical findings. Not all of these elements are required though. It will really depend on the vulnerability, the report type, what you're really after, what potentially the client's after, and maybe they have their own brand guidelines or kind of formatting issues they want. But you can see from the table that there is quite a few of these kind of information points we can go through. You've got product, service, URL. I think that's kind of normal to ask for, especially if it's like a website or, for example, a big large estate. We really want to know what system we're looking at. You can also say operating system, the version information. Again, they're just kind of identifiers of that asset. So if you're hacking into their Windows 7 computers, for example, rather than a Windows 10, something like that, then we can quickly identify, and potentially they could then sort out their asset list to identify where that system is. A technical description, this should be written in almost a way in which someone could follow along and pick up everything you're doing and be able to reproduce the results. Alongside that, you may want to provide like some sample code, so if you've got a proof of concept to prove it works, then you want to be able to kind of provide that as well. Now, in a penetration testing report, you probably don't need to give the reporter's contact information, but let's say you're working on a large pen test with multiple people, then you might want to put in the pen tester's name who found that vulnerability, so therefore if you have to do a follow-up meeting, then you can request that specific person rather than the full team, as they might be away doing other jobs. Another thing in here that's quite important to mention is probably risk assessment. This is obviously kind of, we're talking about risk, but this can take many forms. It could be something like the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, or it could be something like the EPSS. There is quite a lot in there, and you could obviously rate it however you wish. You don't have to rate it against what your client tells you to rate it as. There's a lot of moving parts when it comes to risk assessment, but it's a very important thing to probably include, as the person who is on the receiving end of the report would probably want to sort out the most pressing issues first. What I kind of talked about there with that international standard was really the information. Now, you might want to provide that in a table, but ideally you also want to be telling a story. You want to be kind of showing the client how you got there, and this is where you're able to kind of really show maybe the attack chain, all the kind of stuff that goes into it, because again, you might not be fully aware of what their infrastructure looks like. So by bringing up as much information as possible, you might help the client understand, oh, this has a very big potential to be a problem, but the pen test is not knowing that because they don't understand the knowledge that we have behind it. So I've got a wee kind of blue text box here that kind of goes through that. And This kind of gives an example of telling a story. I've still got some of that information that we asked for example, such as the service information on there, and as well as some more information about the kind of known vulnerabilities. And I think that kind of helps present much more of a narrative around what we're identifying, and therefore they can then use that to fully understand the concept and scenarios going forward. You might also want to think about like kind of what drew you to this element, the kind of bit you're looking at. What was the vulnerability discovered? What impact does it have on the organisation? Did you attempt to exploit it, or was it just kind of there so you didn't need to because it was very low-hanging fruit? How difficult was it to construct an exploit? Did you have to spend a long time, or were you able to just pick one off of a kind of proof of concept list and then use it straight away? Can further exploitation after this be attained? And what can an organisation do to remediate the issue really quickly? And what can they then do to make sure they don't have this type of vulnerability class again? And those last points are quite poignant to the next point I was going to make, which is about detailed mitigation recommendations. It's all well and good that we are penetration testers and we find vulnerabilities, but then we have to actually provide the person who's reading it with, how do we fix this? Now, in some cases, we might be able to see the code and recommend a quick fix. Otherwise, we might actually have to be we don't understand the code, we don't really get to see all of it. So therefore, you might have to then have meetings later on where you have to speak through it. So if you can front load with as much information as possible, this can help out tremendously. Obviously, depending on your background, you might not have the understanding to give these detailed mitigation recommendations. You might have to, again, go look yourself. And this really comes down to, again, your methodology, understanding what you're doing, so therefore you can give the best remediation possible. This may require you giving more than one recommendation. You might have to think about long-term as well as short-term, as well as potentially talking about patch cycles, when stuff has went out of support and other things. It can be very detailed and it can be a lot of research in this section. The best way to get better at this kind of stuff though is to try it yourself. Take a vulnerability report, potentially your own that you've already done, or a publicly disclosed one, be it a pen test report that you can find online, or maybe a bug bounty one on HackerOne or BugCrowd, and read through it. Read through it from both the pen tester's point of view and the remediation team's point of view. How would you respond to that? What do you do next as a person who's using this? If you can find one on open source software, even better. Some of the OWASP projects have the vulnerability reports inside their GitHub stuff, so you'll be able to look at that and then work off of what they've been able to find and how then they've fixed it, and that might give you some much more kind of complete worldview of how it is interacted with. And just to finally conclude, formatting and English are important, but as you've kind of came to see over this talk, there's a lot more than just your spelling and grammar. We've covered kind of several tips and tricks to include some more detail, as well as, you know, find ways in which we can get around that, and also talk about your experience is going to come into this quite a lot. And the feedback you get from clients and your experience means that you can tailor yourself going forward, and then also tailor towards whatever your next upcoming client is, and you're able to go from there. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for listening. Bye bye.